and welcome to the University of Toronto Mississauga's webinar entitled Why Does It Feel So Good to Be Bad? My name is Hayes Scheckmeyer, and I'm a proud U of T alumni. I'm a life event transition consultant committed to supporting individuals who want to move from surviving to thriving on their journey through life events. After the unexpected and unnerving loss of my dream job in 2019, I launched a platform called Grow My Grit to facilitate powerful, unconventional conversations about navigating life events with grit, renewed passion, and purpose. Since taking my career into my own hands, I've used that platform to elevate the importance of reframing our thoughts when it's time to make a major transition. I promote shifting our thoughts to the unique strengths and resources we reliably bring to challenging situations. And I am so pleased to invite you and welcome you to tonight's presentation. Although this event takes place online, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Today, we have alumni and friends from all over the world watching this event, as well as all across Canada and the United States. We welcome everyone attending from around the world. Following this presentation, there will be a moderated question and answer period, and we encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you're having technical difficulties, please use the chat button, and one of our staff will be there to assist you through a private message. Today, I'm delighted to introduce our presenter. Please join me in welcoming Paul Bloom. Paul Bloom is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and the Brooks and Suzanne Ragen Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Yale University. Paul Bloom studies how children and adults make sense of the world, with a special focus on pleasure, morality, religion, fiction, and art. He has won numerous awards for his research and teaching. Paul is also past president of the Society for Philosophy and Psychology and co-editor of Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and has written for scientific journals such as Nature and Science, and for popular outlets such as the New York Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, and The Atlantic Monthly. Paul has authored 7 books, including his latest, Psych, The Story of the Human Mind. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Paul. And without further ado, I'll let you get started.
Thank you, Hayes, and thank you for the wonderful introduction, and thank you all for being here. Let me see if my screen will come on. And before I get started, does everybody see that? Okay.
Looks great, Paul.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. About 1600 years ago, St. Augustine wrote the Confessions, the story of his youthful descent into sin and his subsequent conversion to Christianity. And the Confessions begins with book 2 of the Confessions has a terrific first sentence. Augustine writes, "I propose now to set down my past wickedness and the carnal corruption of my soul." So you're expecting a lot of sex. But to the disappointment of many readers over history, Augustine focuses most of his energy on a quite different sin. He describes how he and his friends broke into an orchard and stole some pears. That was it. But this sin fascinated Augustine. He writes, "It was not the pears that my unhappy soul desired. I had plenty of my own, and I only picked those so that I might steal. For no sooner than I picked them, I threw them away and tasted nothing in them but my own sin, which I relished and enjoyed. I had no motivation for wickedness except wickedness itself. It was foul, and I loved it." Now, philosophers and psychologists sometimes call this a perverse action, an action done for the sake of being bad. I became interested in this, and I set up what I call the Perversity Project, where I went online and I asked people to tell me stories about perverse acts that they did. I gave him these instructions. I told him that I wanted to hear about perverse actions, those where you choose to do something you know is wrong, morally or otherwise, at least in part because it's wrong. And he gave examples like breaking a rule or doing something for the sake of doing something stupid. And I got many responses. Here's one of the first responses that I got. Flirted with a woman's boyfriend, knowing fully well he liked me. I knew I could steal him if I wanted, but I didn't want to do that. I just wanted her to feel uncomfortable whenever three of us were in the same room. Causing people pain is wrong, but that's exactly why I did it. This is also the plot of the Dolly Parton song, Jolene, by the way. Here's another respondent. Ice skating on a park, dark and frozen spot 30 yards out. Instead of avoiding it, I skate towards it, knowing but wondering, and splash. Now, in these cases, the perverse acts are destructive or self-destructive. And in fact, a lot of people think about perversity in that way. The sort of individual most emblematic of a perverse agent is the Joker from the Batman comics. As Batman's butler Alfred once said, some men can't be bullied, they can't be reasoned with, they can't be bought. Some men just want the world to burn. And this is a sort of great description of a perverse agent. It turns out there's a scale to figure out how perverse you are. So there's the need for chaos scale. And you could rank yourself on questions like, I think society should be burnt to the ground. I need chaos around me. It's too boring if nothing is going on. And sometimes I just feel like destroying beautiful things. Some people answer 0 to all of these, but some people feel a bit of the appetite, feel a bit of the perverse urge for destruction. Now, not all perversion involves harm. Some is more mischievous. So here's another story I got. On one occasion in my early 20s, I was out with a friend. He decided to get himself an ice cream, and before he had a chance to try it, I stuck my finger in it. I played it off as a joke, but really I had the sudden thought, man, it'd be fucked up if I just jammed my finger in this ice cream. Or take this. When I was in a professional choir as a child, at every concert I felt the desire to sing a few notes very incorrectly on purpose. To this day, I don't completely understand why. Or this one, a very mild and kind of sweet example of a perverse desire. Sometimes I walk on the grass instead of the path, just because it's wrong. So once you start looking for perversity, you see it everywhere. There's a book I have called Profane Waste, which is a picture book of people destroying precious items, like setting fire to money. And perversity needs to be distinguished from other things that are similar. So a perverse act isn't a mistake. If you want to do something smart and instead do something dumb, that's not perverse. It's also not weakness of will. If I have a big talk the next day and I stay up all night drinking because I can't help myself, that's maladaptive, but it's not perverse. Sexual acts are sometimes called perverse, and my friend Jesse Baring has a wonderfully titled book called Perv. But this also isn't perversity in the sense that I'm interested in. Some sexual acts are perverse, but a lot aren't, and a lot of perverse acts, as we'll see, aren't sexual at all. A nice definition, maybe a strong definition of perversity, comes from the philosopher David Sussman. So he defines perverse acts as those actions undertaken when our normal desire for the good, perhaps the moral good, or maybe just a narrower good of self-interest, is reversed. You know, most people go to the good, the perverse person goes to the bad. And some people believe that such cases exist. They certainly exist in fiction. Hannibal Lecter is a nice example of a perverse agent. So is the Joker, and so is Satan, who famously said in Paradise Lost, "Evil be thou my good," inverting the goal of doing good to the goal of doing evil. But there are skeptics, and one skeptic is my colleague Sergio Tannenbaum at University of Toronto. Sergio writes, if someone insists that Satan's motivation is really just to pursue the bad as such, aren't we tempted to ask, what's the good of it? What's the good of being bad? Aren't we tempted to look for a deeper motive? And this is what I want to do in the rest of this talk. I actually want to look at 4 deeper motives, 4 stories for why we might do bad things, but not as an end in itself, but rather to satisfy some other goal. So here's the first, and this takes us back to Augustine. Augustine was quite clear when he described his sin that he didn't do it due to peer pressure. He didn't do it because he was surrounded by other people. But later on in his book, he pulls back a bit. He writes, I wouldn't have done it by myself. My satisfaction did not lie in the pears, it lay in the crime itself, committed in league with a gang of sinners. And a lot of the things we do, self-destructive things, violent things, sadomasochistic things like eating hot peppers, we do because we want to impress others. We want to show off. I think some famous examples of artistic perversity fall into this category. Over 100 years ago, there was an art competition in New York, and they invited anybody to submit anything as an artwork. So Marcel Duchamp sent in a urinal, which he called Fountain. And they rejected it. They said, we only accept art. But he insisted, and his perverse act turned out to be one of the foundational works of contemporary art. Or take Banksy. A few years ago, Banksy put up a print for sale at Sotheby's. We went for auction. And as soon as the gavel went down, a machine hidden in the frame shredded the print halfway through, to the horror of the people around. Banksy wrote, the urge to destroy is also a creative urge. Now, I think there's different things going on in both of these cases, but I think one of the things that we see here is a desire to show off, a desire to impress. And in fact, both Duchamp and Banksy became very famous, or Banksy's case, much more famous, due to their actions. So here the agent does the bad thing, but not as a goal in itself. The agent does the bad thing to get status, to impress. The second example of perversity, the second case of perversity, is what you can call jackrabbit perversity, where you act in some way that's unexpected or irrational. It's sometimes said that jackrabbits move around randomly when they're being chased by a predator, because if they were non-random, and if they knew what they were doing and could give away their motion, they would be able to be caught and eaten. Now, unpredictability is not perversity. If I ask you to choose a number from 1 to 1,000,000, that's unpredictable, but it's not perverse. But still, they're related. And one way they're related is that the rational is usually predictable. Suppose you were going to murder me, and you were going to murder me on my way to work. So you know where I live, you know my house, and you know where my office is, and you want to catch me on my way to work. Well, how do you know what path I'll take? One perfectly reasonable answer is you take the path that's the most rational path. You check Google Maps. And if I behave rationally in this way, predictably, I'm a sucker. You'll murder me. If I knew somebody was trying to murder me, what I would do is I would behave unpredictably. I would go random paths, inefficient paths, lengthy paths, a different one each day. And this sort of unpredictability will set you up for, makes it harder to deal with. So here we're bad, irrational, because we want to be unpredictable. But there's a variant of this proposed by Rory Sutherland, who's an advertising executive. And Sutherland writes, irrational people are much more powerful than rational people because their threats are much more convincing. What does he mean by this? Well, take an example. As he was writing this, there was a presidential election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And Sutherland said, look, regardless of who you're going to vote for and who your preference is, there's one thing you have to admit. There's a certain sense in which Trump is a better negotiator than Clinton. Because Clinton is rational. She sets herself up as a rational, reasoned agent. And so if she made a threat that you wouldn't, that doesn't seem reasonable, it seems excessive or bizarre or self-destructive, you could reasonably assume she's not going to do it. Trump is less rational, less reasoned in his behavior, and so his threats are much more powerful. There's actually a specific example I think about in this case, which shows up in different books and movies. And this involves threats to dead people. And here's the sort of case I'm thinking about from Dennis Lehane's book, Live by Night. Our main character is approached by a psychopathic mobster. And the mobster demands does something terrible that he doesn't want to do. The mobster says, look, if you don't do it, I'm going to kill your father. And so our character thinks. And then the mobster says, look, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking if you find this too horrible to do, you could always kill yourself. But I'll tell you, if you kill yourself, I'll kill your father anyway. And my God is thinking, and he's thinking that'd be ridiculous. There'd be no point to it. I'd already be dead. But he knows that that mobster is sufficiently psychopathic, he would do it anyway. And as such, his threat has a power that a more reasonable person could never have. Sutherland goes on to write, if driverless cars stop reliably whenever a pedestrian appears in front of them, pedestrian crossings will be unnecessary and jaywalkers will be able to march into the road, forcing the driverless car to stop suddenly. To prevent this, driverless cars may have to learn to be angry and to occasionally maliciously fail to stop in time and strike the pedestrian on the shins. And this last part, the idea of being angry, speaks to a more general theory of the emotions, one developed by Robert Frank and others, which is the emotions can be seen as commitment devices that drive us to do erratic things, like respond disproportionately. And you might think, well, what's the good of that? But when you're dealing with an agent who's going to respond disproportionately, their threats have to be taken much more seriously. You could pull things over a rational being that you can't pull over an irrational being. And in this regard, as in these other ways, perversity carries an advantage. A third force for perversity, well, is illustrated by the example of the Tide Pod Challenge. So some of you may remember when the teenagers of America were plunging Tide Pod capsules into their mouth. And this was very upsetting to the company, Procter & Gamble, that owned the Tide Pod companies. There were a lot of newspaper reports telling people to stop doing it. Teens are daring each other to eat Tide Pods. We don't need to tell you that that's a bad idea. And they spent a lot of money with ads trying to get people to stop. So one ad used the popular football player Gronk. Somebody asked Gronk, hey, Gronk, is eating Tide Pods ever a good idea? And Gronk says no. Jonah Berger pointed out that when these ads came up, the consumption of Tide Pods shot up, not down. People were motivated to do it by all the people telling them to say no. And it was only when Procter & Gamble got smart enough to sort of shut up about it that gradually this trend faded. The idea that we react to threats to our autonomy, that we don't like being told what not to do, is an old one. Theologians have pointed out that Augustine's transgressions with the pears is only the second most famous biblical story of a sin committed with fruit. The first one, of course, being Eve eating from the tree of good and evil. And, the theologians have not missed the fact that Eve did the one thing she wasn't supposed to. And the idea there's this impulse to do this shows up all over the place. Some of my favorite example of this comes from one of my favorite TV shows, Better Call Saul. And in the scene, Jimmy McGill, Saul has come clean. He has decided to live a good, respectable life. He has a job at a law office. He has a good salary. And in the final scene of the episode, he turns to the wall and sees this. It says, always leave on, do not turn off. And the final scene is Jimmy McGill picking away at the Scotch tape so he could throw the switch, which foreshadows, of course, what's going to follow. The desire I'm talking about comes under different names: self-governance, freedom, liberty, agency. But it can be best summed up in terms of autonomy. We have a desire for autonomy. We have a desire to enact our own wishes and our own desires independent of other forces. This falls under the branch of psychology known as reactance theory. It's a clever title. A 50-year review of psychological reactance theories. Do not read this article. Um, and there are actually now several demonstrations that telling people not to do something ups the odds that they'll do it. So reactance is summed up as an unpleasant feeling that emerges when people experience a threat to or loss of their free behaviors, and it motivates them to reestablish the threat and freedom. And so there are studies finding, there are studies finding that vaccine mandates, under some circumstances, make people less likely to want to use vaccines, not more. That warnings against smoking and also against binge drinking, for that matter, increase the habits that you're trying to avoid. They don't diminish them. And there's a nice study by some political scientists on threats of reprisal. So in this study, people are told about a dictator in a foreign country, and a dictator is doing some terrible things to his citizens, and you are a diplomat, you get to choose, and the choice you have to make is whether or not you're going to sanction this dictator to stop him from doing his actions. And in one condition, if you do that, nothing bad's going to happen. You have the control to do that. But in the second condition, the dictator warns you that if you do that, he's going to unleash terrorist attacks upon your country. Now, this is set up so that the second act becomes more costly. But as the scientists predicted, this makes people more likely to do it. Telling somebody, don't do this or I'll punish you, can, under some circumstances, motivate people to be more likely to do it. The theme, more generally, of autonomy, of wanting to be free, is a staple of existentialist philosophy. It's expressed in all sorts of ways. My favorite version of it is from Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, where his insane character says, 2 times 2 makes 4 seems to me simply a piece of insolence. 2 times 2 makes 4 is a fop standing with arms akimbo, barring your path and spitting. If we are going to praise everything, 2 times 2 makes 5 is also a very charming little thing. And I think this connects particularly to perversity in a sense that if you just do what's right, if you just follow the moral action, if you just follow the rational action, what good are you? You could be replaced by a machine. If you want to express your humanity, your authenticity, it would behoove you to do something different. So here there is again perversity, but now perversity speaks to a broader goal, that of autonomy. The fourth and final force I want to talk about for perversity, I think one particularly interesting one, is nicely illustrated in a classic episode of the television show Seinfeld called The Opposite. And you don't have to see Seinfeld to get it. I will tell you, though, that on IMDb, The Opposite is the highest rated show. So the episode begins with George, this hapless character, having been humiliated in some aspect of life or another, and then complaining to his friends. And he says, "It all became very clear to me, sitting out there today, that every decision I've ever made in my entire life has been wrong. My life is the complete opposite of everything I want it to be. Every instinct I have in every aspect of life, be it something to wear, something to eat, it's all been wrong, every one." And then Jerry gives him some surprising advice. If every instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right. Now, this being a comedy, George goes on to take that advice, and he approaches a beautiful woman and says to her very honestly, "My name is George, I am unemployed and I live with my parents." And she swoons over him. He tells during a job interview he's obscene and rude, and he gets the job. I don't think that that's actually practical advice. I'm not going to suggest to anybody that they do the opposite. To my shock, as I began to work on this talk and think about these issues, I found online that there are people actually telling people to do the opposite. This is presumably good startup advice and leadership advice, but it's not. I mean, for one thing, a lot of things don't even have an opposite. For another, often the opposite is a dumb thing to do. Everyone wears clothes. You should wear clothes. Everybody uses English in a certain way. You should use English in the same way. But there are certain specific cases, I think, where this ultimately perverse act, this total opposite act, can pay off. So it's usually stupid, but not always. So one case is when you're systematically bad at making a certain type of decision, worse than random. So in the case of George, it's many different behaviors. And in the case of me, it's directions. I'm very, very bad at directions. I am sufficiently bad at directions that sometimes I'm tempted to figure out where I think the right way to go is and then flip it and go to opposite direction. And if so, that'd be a case where there'd be a rationality and perversity. Another case is when you need to stand out in a crowded field of rational agents. Suppose you're competing for something and everybody around you is pretty smart. And it's not enough to tie. It's not enough to do as well as them. You have to stand out. You have to excel. Well, there's a way to do so. And what this is somewhat paradoxically not doing the most rational thing. And here's an example from the game Wordle. So you have to know how Wordle works to appreciate this. The idea is you choose a word and then you get feedback on whether your word matches the expected word and whether the letter's in the right place or whether the letter is the right letter but in the wrong place. And then you keep trying till you get the proper word. It turns out there's a smart strategy for Wordle. You use high frequency letters that go together to get words like crate. And this is what my wife does. And so every morning she does crate and she gets the word pretty quickly. I'm more of a experiential player of Wordle. So every morning I think of a different word. So for instance, one morning I did the word puppy. Puppy's a terrible word for Wordle. But it so happened that on that morning, the target word was guppy, and I got it in 2. Now, the moral here is, if we were just competing to see who will do better on average, crate beats puppy every time, perfectly rational. But if we were competing in a situation where there could be only one winner and ties don't count, doing the unconventional move can pay off. The third case where this sort of perversity plays some value is what you could call hopeful monsters. So one of the great insights of biological evolution is that nature doesn't make jumps. Darwinian evolution works by creatures just having these subtle shifts in their phenotypes due to mutation, due to sexual recombination, and those modifications that do better end up reproducing more, and then you get more of that, and gradually you move up an adaptive landscape to get better and better organisms, better in the sense of a better fit with their environment. And so this is a nice illustration. This is an adaptive landscape. The higher you are on the landscape, the better, the more prolific you are, the more better you're doing. And in a situation like this, the creature, the organism, the species, whatever that is in red, will creep up to the top. But there's a problem here, and it's sometimes described as a problem of local maximum, which is, what if you want to get up to that high peak there? Well, you can't, because every step off the top is a step down. And so you get stuck at certain levels. And it's sometimes argued that natural selection has come across a solution to this problem, sometimes called a hopeful monster. And a hopeful monster is basically a large mutation. Now, most of the time, large mutations are disasters. They leave the species, they leave an animal dead, they leave the offspring dead. But sometimes these crazy jumps will take you out of your space and land you to a higher space. It's these crazy jumps that will get you from there to there. Now, I'm not suggesting that the genius of an Einstein or a Duchamp could be summed up in terms of a wild ass shot in the dark. I think more that these crazy jumps might make the most sense when you are metaphorically, for the adaptive landscape, in a rut, when you're stuck too low, and every small step you take leads you off worse. So, a big step, a jump, might be the right way to go. So here again, in these cases, the agent pursues the bad as a mechanism to get the good. There are other forces for perversity. I'll briefly mention yet another one, which is boredom. So there's some research suggesting that the certain sort of perversity involved in sadistic aggression is motivated by boredom. This shows up in correlational studies, so generalized across a variety of important social contexts, including online trolling, sadism in the military, sadistic behavior among parents, and sadistic fantasies. And also experimentally, you do an experiment where you make people bored, and you find this increases their sadistic behavior, killing worms, destroying other people's pay, and so on. And it wouldn't surprise me if there are other candidate explanations for perversity that you could talk about. I've used, when talking about perversity, I've sort of had a big tent, including a whole range of things. Some of the acts which I would view as perverse are more instinctive, and others are sort of more self-conscious. So as an example of sort of more instinctive behavior, consider risk-taking behavior. So in this review, they talk about risk-taking behavior in adolescence, and they point out that when compared to adults, adolescents show an unbalanced and extremes-oriented behavior consisting of an increased novelty seeking, together with decreased novelty-induced stress and anxiety, increased risk-taking behavior, as well as elevated levels of impulsivity and restlessness. Now, when I call this instinctive on the part of adolescents, one reason is that these are not human adolescents, they are adolescent mice. So I don't think they're reasoning their way through an Augustinian immoral act. I think they're rather wired up to take more chances and behave more perversely at a certain point in development. On the other extreme, sometimes perversity is carefully thought out. Perversity in the act of comedy and humor is something that we seek out and we do on purpose, and that we do fully, not only knowingly on the part of the perverse agent, but knowingly on the part of action of the audience for the perversity. And most perverse acts fall somewhere in between. I find perversity very interesting. I find it very interesting and very important. And this is for a few reasons. One reason is it's really worth knowing that there are some people in the world who really do want the world to burn. And to know that at least some of us, at least some of the time, want the world to burn ourselves. It's worth knowing, particularly when you look at political and social changes, that one force that guides people to do what they do, certain acts of voting, certain decisions they make, is to give the middle finger to everybody who tells them that it's the other thing that's rational, it's the other thing that's moral. To put it a different way, it might be that telling people what they're doing is really stupid and immoral is a very poor way to get them to stop doing it. And if this is true, it's something worth knowing for people who are interested in policy and policy change. I think perversity is at the root of certain interesting things, certain artistic and perhaps even scientific innovations. And I also think life is just a little bit more interesting in a world where, you lean over and you lick your buddy's ice cream cone. A life with just a little bit of perversity, the right amount, could be a life that's a lot more fun. I'm also interested in perversity as a scientist of the mind. I tend to agree with David Velleman in his complaint about how a lot of our psychology is being done, particularly our moral psychology and our psychology of action. So he writes, the agent portrayed in much philosophy of action is, let's face it, a square. Our moral philosophy is characterized a particular species of agent, and a particularly bland species of agent at that. It is characterized an earnest agent, while ignoring those agents who are disaffected, refractory, silly, satanic, or punk. I hope for a moral psychology that has room for the whole motley crew. And so do I. And so I'll stop with that.
Thank you so much for your insights. Thank you so much for these perspectives. And I invite everyone here to remember that there are questions you can submit your questions via the Q&A function, and those will get to me. And I see one question has come in. If calling out negative or immoral behavior often encourages the opposite reaction than the one that is desired, how do we as a society challenge deviant behavior?
It's a good question. And plainly, I like the question because it says, for the most part, calling out deviant behavior does lower its frequency. People are extremely sensitive to reputation. If I knew that I would give a talk that would lead me to be humiliated and criticized, punished, lose my job, if I knew I'd be arrested, I'm less likely to do it.
Yeah.
Public shaming works, prisons work, punishments work. We're sensitive to that sort of thing. So you never want to say that just disapproval will drive people to engage in perverse actions. It's interesting then, in what circumstances will it? And I think the circumstances tend to be specific. They often tend to be specifically with specific sort of people. Telling your toddler, not to throw her food might actually end up with your toddler throwing her food. It would come up in cases where people are particularly concerned about their autonomy and their freedom. And it would come out in cases where the negative responses people get are seen not as sort of driven by moral forces. They're not seen as driven by some sort of higher practical good, but they're seen as being born out of a desire to staunch people's freedom. And that really does lead to a backlash.
Fair, very fair. Thank you for that. And just from my end, a little bit of curiosity along those lines, speaking about having the opposite reaction, does the prevalence of these kinds of television shows, you've referenced Seinfeld, you've referenced the Three Stooges, is there any research on the ways in which people are kind of satiated on their particular perverse desires by seeing them acted out on others? Is there any conversation of how people kind of get their fix by seeing someone else engage in that?
A good question. It's kind of a parallel question I guess asked about pornography, which is, does seeing it sate one's desires? So if I see Larry David do a bunch of ridiculous, perverse, offensive acts, does that get it out of my system? And I don't want to do it myself. Or does it encourage me to do it? Does it model it for me? Does it suggest to me that it's fun? And I don't know. You have two different theories pushing in opposite directions. I guess I'll cop out and say probably one thing for one type of person, another for another.
Okay, that's not copping out. That is recognizing the range of experiences and the range of preferences. Thank you for that. Another question has come in. As a lawyer, some or many of my clients act in a way that is perverse and deviant to what many would consider logical, and yet the agent believes himself to be perfectly rational. Can you provide any insight on those who believe their irrational behavior is in fact quite rational?
I think that's an entirely different kind of thing. And so I think that's what we see a lot, where you see people doing what you'd normally call stupid things, stupid, irresponsible, violent things. I don't know. That's a simple example. Refusing to pay your taxes. And think, oh, this is a good plan. I'm not going to pay my taxes. I'll think of all the money I save. And a lawyer says, well, you get in trouble for this. And they think not me. Those are just mistakes.
Yeah.
And we could talk a lot about why people make mistakes and the kind of people who make mistakes and the circumstances under which they make mistakes. But from the standpoint of human psychology, The motivation here is entirely everyday, regular. Just like you, this person wants to achieve some reasonable ends. They want to make money, they want to impress people, and so on. Just like you, they have a plan. Different from you, they have a dumb plan. So there's nothing perverse about it. It's just dumb. It's just mistaken.
Thank you so much for that. Another question has come in. You remind me of De La Rochefoucauld, who once said, "No man deserves to be praised for his goodness unless he has the strength of character to do evil. All other forms of goodness are nothing but indolence and impotence of will." The question is, how does perversity relate to evil and the feeling good to be bad as the topic of your presentation?
No, there's a lot there. I mean, there's as I think a lot of people here know, there's different conceptions of the good. So some people think the good, something's only good in the backdrop of an evil temptation. Immanuel Kant is said to have believed that. Well, other people think, no, what's really good is practiced. So is in fact part of one's virtue, part entrained. So I'm not really a good person when I'm hanging out with my kids if I'm constantly fighting the urge to molest them or hit them. You know, goodness could just be virtuous. Um, and I'm not sure where I stand on that. I think it gets complicated. Perversity connects to evil in those cases where the perverse choice is an evil choice, where you know the right thing to do, but you choose to do the wrong thing. And in this case, it'd be the morally wrong thing, the evil thing, the cruel thing. Now, where I disagree with some other people is that I don't think the motivation is ever pure evil. I think the motivation always something else. You want to impress people. You want to show off your status. You want to exert your power. But still, people do willingly do evil things, um, perversely evil things, due to the same sort of perverse motivations we've been talking about.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Another question has come in. I'm very interested in redirecting high psychopathy youth to use their superpower for a pro-social end. What do you think is key to motivate that outcome?
So what are if I could ask the person, what's the superpower that psychopathic youths have? I would imagine they'd have like a deficit. They have a deficit in self-control and consciousness and conscientiousness and so on. So what would the superpower be?
So I will let that person get
Yeah.
back to us in the chat, and then I'll move to the next question so that
Oh, could we just light them up on the screen?
Yep. So it's come back. Yep. So they don't really care to fit morals.
Yeah.
That's
Well, I don't know. I don't know how I'd persuade somebody who didn't care about right and wrong that they should care about right and wrong. The boring answer is, well, you punish them. You say, look, and in some way, you could say this is what punishment for adults is for. It's for people for whom the desire to do the right thing isn't sufficient. But I don't have any answer to how one should treat a psychopath. I know that there's experts in this. My colleague at Yale, Ariel Baskin-Summers, has done research on this. Other people have studied psychopathy, but it's not an area I know much about. And so not being an expert, I tend to lean a little bit pessimistic.
okay. That's fair too. Thank you so much for that. Another question's come in. Trump is perverse in nearly every sphere, but my question has to do with his supporters. Are there any studies about whether they are prepared to act perversely, or do they like to simply witness perversity? Storming the Capitol was action for sure, but does he have a lot of supporters who are devoted because they like observing perversity, but not themselves acting?
Yeah, there's some data on this, maybe not enough, but a lot of people who support Trump are impressed by his perverse nature. He is not not law abiding in any sort of literal sense. He doesn't show much respect for institutions. He has a great sense of humor. He's funny. He's snarky. He's disrespectful. And so it appeals to a certain sort of person who likes that. And again, I have a feeling that many people who disapprove vocally about Trump on those dimensions, saying, he has no respect for other Republicans. He has no respect for the Democrats. He's not nice, are kind of missing the point if they want to persuade Trump supporters. Trump supporters know this. Trump is very popular just because of his chaotic nature. His chaotic nature impresses many people. And there's no equivalent there's no equally chaotic Democrat.
Mm.
So I think that that's worth knowing. It's worth knowing if you're running against Trump that, to tell his supporters he's chaotic and perverse. That's for them, that's a feature, not a bug.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you for that. Another question. Perversion in one society may not be perverse in
Yeah.
another. What do we do when the concept of perversion differs so greatly among different groups?
So you're absolutely right. There's variation in what we count as perverse in one society versus another. Um, a lot of, for instance, what happens in contemporary modern art would be seen extremely perverse in a traditional artistic culture. But if you do it in modern day Manhattan, nobody even blinks an eye.
Mm.
I don't think it's a different notion of perverse. Rather, it's a different notion of what the rules are. So, if I walk around without a shirt down a beach in Rio, it's not a perverse action because no one else is wearing a shirt. If I do so in downtown Toronto in the winter, that's irrational and inappropriate and everything like that. In Rio and in Toronto, I have the same notion of perverse. There's just different rules. So perversity could be seen in some way as always relative to the rules, the principles, the morals, the rationality you have in your society. And so that's where I would place the cross-cultural differences. I would say not a different notion of perversity, but a different notion of what it is you're supposed to do to be non-perverse.
Indeed. And I think as a listener, what I hear you saying too is that the reaction is equally important. That reaction will change depending on where you are. So not only the action of the agent, but the response that he or she or they receive will absolutely predict, possibly influence some of what gets considered to be perverse.
Yeah, that's right. And if you try to if you use perversity as a signal for how bold and ostentatious you are, you got to kind of do it right. There's too many there's sort of a running joke about very old rockers like Marilyn Manson or whatever running around trying to shock people, and people say that's not that very shocking.
Yeah.
So you have to titrate it properly.
Yes, it's true. Very good. Yes. Another question has come in. Where would the act of cheating in a relationship land in the aspect of irrational, pervasive thoughts, meaning that the cheating was not pre planned or considered beforehand?
It's a good question. I mean, people cheat for all sorts of reasons, and men cheat for somewhat different reasons than women on average. Um, I think it connects to perversity, where you could imagine somebody, and there are some cases like this, and this is sort of what you mentioned, where the cheating isn't a sort of long-standing decision. It's not a rational choice to switch partners. It's more born out of like, this is this crazy ass thing to do. Everything's going well. I'm going to knock it all down. And I think that could be an example of a very perverse action, and often one which has terribly destructive consequences. But sometimes there's a part of us where we know exactly the right thing to do. Everything is all lined up, and then we tear it down. I mean, a similar example is people who end up returning to addictions. And there are many cases where people, who gave up alcohol as a very stressful situation and so on, and then they move to alcohol again. But then there's these cases of people who have not had a drink for years and years and years and years. Everything's going fine. They're going for a walk downtown and they just walk into a bar and they have, a whiskey. And it's like something clicks and they said, I don't want to follow the rules anymore.
Thank you for that. So, another thought coming in, you gave many great examples from Western philosophy, psychology, and comedy. Do you know of any Eastern philosophy perspectives that could add to this conversation?
So that's a great question. And in a longer version of my talk, I try to explore some of the cross-cultural questions. I do think perversity is at some level universal, that the appetite for it shows up in different ways, will show up everywhere in the world. Um, the connection I'm thinking about is there's sort of a Taoist tradition involving basically clowning around and goofing around. And there are figures within non-Western religions which are funny, and gross and inappropriate. Um, and I think that those are sort of, you could see in there people taking very seriously perverse agents.
And I appreciate that reference to if this had been a longer talk. I think it's really important to remind everyone you have 7 books, you have quite a lot of content. So this may just be your introduction to Paul's work, but please make a point of following up and learning more. Thank you for that explanation. Another line of thinking, is there a difference in your analysis between feeling good by doing good and feeling good by doing bad?
I think there is. I think there are different sorts of feelings. So I think that there's something natural about feeling good by doing good. There's a lot of evidence for adults and for children, and fairly universally, that the right sort of altruism, helping people, being kind to people, feels good. It makes us feel good about ourselves. It's adaptive in that it means that other people feel obligated to us and will help us in the future. Feeling good by doing bad is a very different kind of animal. And
Mm.
this is the perverse behavior is patterns in different ways. So for one thing, the sort of feeling good by being good shows up at every point in your life. I think perverse behaviors tend to show up more in certain points of life than others. Um, in particular, it tends to show up a lot in your terrible twos. 2-year-olds are incredibly perverse agents. Adolescence, maybe the midlife crisis.
Yeah.
I think there's always a little bit of perversity in a normal life, even what a friend of mine called micro perversity, where you just kind of goof around a little bit. But it patterns differently than simple altruism and simple kindness.
Okay. Very powerful. Very powerful. Thank you. And what do you think about a communal motive to fulfill needs to belong? Do you think some people try to do something bad to fit in, or do those who engage in perverse behaviors look for a community of wrongdoings, or perhaps both?
I'd say perhaps both. I think that um, we do try to find a fit with our proclivities for the people around us, and it's true that if you're in certain communities, um, I don't know, I'm with a bunch of tenured professors.
Yes.
Perversity is not going to go very far.
Mm.
People like obedience and kind of conformity. Um, Different than I'm part of a motorcycle gang or an improv, uh, doing improv comedy or something.
Yeah.
So I bet there's both. I bet we signal for the community we're in, but we probably seek out and maybe are accepted by members of the community whose interests match our capacities. You know, just to take it, sometimes this talk gets a bit fancy and overly formal. So think about a class clown. So the class clown, wants to be funny, wants to, he's the one who sticks the pencils up his nose and says the weird things and everything like that and tries to impress people. And he'll do however well he does with his normal audience. But if he's lucky, he will have clustered around him the sort of kids who appreciate the class clown.
Yeah. The friends we didn't know we need sometimes, or the community
Exactly.
we didn't know you needed finds its way to you. Fantastic. I just have a quick thought around a little bit of a question around novelty seeking in youth. Just can you
Yeah.
give some insights into potentially exploring that, highlighting that potential need in youth without calling them out on it, but giving some support around managing novelty seeking?
So novelty taking, risk taking, et cetera, shows up for adolescents of both genders, more common in men than women. It's a time to where people are desperate to
Mm.
find mates. They're desperate to do well in the social pecking order. And you don't, as a shy guy, I'll tell you from experience, you don't get this from sitting home reading books. You get it by impressing others, by being funny, by being brave, by being tough, by being goofy.
Yeah.
When we're settled in our lives, so some of us are maybe married, we have kids, we have jobs and everything. You don't need to do it as much. I'm all set. I'm in my status hierarchy. I don't need to jump off a roof to show everybody I could do it. But when you're a teenager and you're working towards getting that status, that's when it's going to come in handy. And, you saw it. It's not just human teenagers, it's mice. It's a very common developmental stage of animals like us where we want to do such a thing.
Okay, so I hear you say keep having the conversation and keep drawing awareness to some of those choices in order to maybe make different ones or just be aware of what consequences might be there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. And now, on behalf of U of T Mississauga, I'd like to thank you, Paul, for your presentation and your responses to the questions from our audience.
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. And then to our audience, we received a lot of questions and we didn't always have a chance to get to them, so we apologize for that. And everyone who registered for today's event will also receive a link to the recording in your inbox within the coming days. And along with the recording, you will have the option to take an online post-event survey. And we do hope you'll take a couple of minutes to complete it, as your feedback is helpful in planning future events. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, be sure to check out the upcoming events, listings, and more on the UTM Alumni webpage. You'll see a link for more information pop up in the chat box now, and it's also included on the post-event survey. Thank you again for joining us. We look forward to hosting you again. Many thanks to Paul Bloom, and we look forward to seeing you at another U of T Mississauga alumni event. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.